Hello and welcome to Red Menace. My name is Alyson Escalante, and I am here without Brett today for an episode that is a little bit different than what we usually do. We've obviously recently been trying to get back into engaging with more texts, but for this month, we are doing something that I think is going to be really exciting, which is that we are actually talking to a number of organizers from the Ultra Red Collective about a trip that they recently took to Central America and some interesting conversations about popular education that I hope will be valuable for our audience. So we're mixing it up a little bit, and I'm hosting solo, but I'm pretty confident that if you've listened to the show for a while and you're familiar with the themes that we talk about, you'll find a lot that is resonant with what we do on this show. So really excited for this interview, and I'll go ahead and just ask if the folks on the call would like to introduce themselves, just who you are, what your organizing kind of background is, just setting that up for our audience.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alyson, for having us. Thank you to Red Menace. My name is Cristina Sanchez Juarez. I am an organizer with the Sacramento Valley Tenants Union, a member of the Ultra Red Collective that is working on research for this journal about Central America. I'm also a former member of LATU, the Los Angeles Tenants Union. I lived in LA for about 9 years and was part of the formative years of that tenants union, and have been doing everything I can to inject some of the lessons learned, particularly in terms of popular education, up here in Sacramento, California.
Thank you again also for having us. I'm very thrilled. I'm Daniela Lieja Quintanar, and I am a member of the Sindicato de Inquilinos de Los Angeles, and I am part of the East Side Local Unión de Vecinos. And I'm originally from Mexico City, and when I arrived here in Boyle Heights, I right away when I connect with the School of Echoes and Ultra Red, and then when the LA Tenants Union starts. So I've been collaborating for a long time now. And I am also a curator and work in contemporary arts.
I'm Tony Carfello. I'm part of the LA Tenants Union for the last decade, and have been working with everybody here before that in the build up to the Tenants Union. And then as the union has grown in the last number of years, have focused my energy in my neighborhood in Los Angeles, the Koreatown, and so we have the Koreatown local of the LA Tenants Union, and that's where most of my work is committed to.
Thank you for inviting us, Alyson, and it's great to be with you and Red Menace. My name is Don Rhine. I'm a member of Ultra Red and also founding organizer, as well as Tony and Christina of the LA Tenants Union. I've been a part of the Hollywood local here since 2017, and I've been with Ultra Red from the beginning in 1994, and it's great to be with you all today.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. And yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation. I'm really glad you all were able to come on and join us. So, like I said, we're going to get into some conversation about this trip that several of you came back from recently. But before we do that, I was wondering if we could address one of the terms that's going to come up here, which is popular education. So on our show, we actually have not done very much conversations about popular education, what it is. We haven't done a ton of work developing it besides like a very cursory introduction to pedagogy of the oppressed as a text. So our listeners may not have the most kind of fleshed out framework for understanding what we mean when we're talking about popular education. And I want to make sure before we get into the details of your trip, we can kind of provide some framework for understanding that term and what it means in practice. So is there anyone that could kind of just provide an overview of what popular education is?
Yeah, I'll get us started. First, I'd like to say that my understanding of popular education comes from And I think maybe this is true for Tony and also for Don and Don has a longer history, of course, engaged in this work, and for Daniela, my understanding of popular education comes from directly, from engaging in the work in as tenant unionists. So I'll give a description or a definition of popular education, but then I want to end with a kind of like an example from our work in the union.
Perfect.
Yeah, popular education is a process of bringing people together to share their lived experiences and to build collective knowledge. It's a process of reflection and action for transforming the world. Its purpose is to challenge oppressive structures, unlike, traditional Western education that molds you or that forces you to contort yourself, right, to capitalism or to the status quo. Our dear mentor, who's on the call with us today, Don Ryan, likes to continually remind us that the word popular in popular education means the poor. So popular education is a liberatory process of and for the poor. I'll share a couple of just kind of key characteristics of popular education. Everyone's knowledge is valuable and important. There's this idea that we can all be teachers and learners. We aren't stuck in one role. These roles are fluid. Another key characteristic is that you begin from people's experiences and produce knowledge from those experiences rather than solely beginning from external sources or from experts in whatever topic you're trying to understand. Popular education was developed in the Global South by a number of different educators. One of the most well-known, of course, is who you mentioned, Alyson, Paulo Freire, who in the 1960s developed new methods for teaching reading and writing to adult learners. He was actually hired by the Brazilian government to do a literacy or alphabetization campaign. And through that work, he started to talk about and theorize this idea of, not centering the teacher. He would talk a lot about the banking model of education, which is what we probably all grew up in, where, the teacher deposits all the knowledge and you are just the one who internalizes that knowledge, but you're not really taught what to do with it. And instead, Paulo Freire said that, that the construction of knowledge should come from people's lived experiences. Popular education was also heavily influenced by liberation theology and Central American mass movements in the 1970s and the 1980s. Liberation theology essentially said that the church, should serve and empower the poor. And so in the case of our work as tenant unionists, one example I could give of how we engage in popular education is, let's say you're having a tenants association meeting. You're gathering a bunch of tenants together to talk about really bad habitability issues or a landlord that's trying to do a mass eviction or what have you. The way that we would engage folks would not be as for example, service providers, where we just come in and we tell people about their tenant rights, and we, give a presentation or something like that, or we refer them to attorneys. Instead, what we do is we begin from people's experiences. We might sit in a circle and everybody will go around and share what's happening in terms of that specific landlord or what issues they're having. And then we collectively come up with a plan. And everybody kind of gives a little bit based on their own expertise as tenants or as people who had just lived and tried to survive in our capitalist world, right? And so that's kind of how we in the tenants union have historically, embodied popular education, is that we're engaged in collective reflection, analysis for action. Perhaps some other folks can also kind of chime in here and add some to the definition.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Christina. This is Don. I appreciate the different aspects to the praxis that you're sort of weaving together. I think one thing that might be useful to mention, perhaps Alyson, for a future episode of Red Menace, but to think about the sort of political context in which popular education in Latin America was developed in the 60s and 70s. There's a number of references that at the time were shared, understood, presumed, that might be unavailable to most folks here in North America and the U.S. So Christina mentioned the banking method and this idea of depositing education. And if you can think about like the late 60s and 70s, those would be very loaded metaphors, particularly in the context of developmentalism and dependency theory. Much of Freire's articulation, development around pedagogy of the oppressed was when he was in exile in Chile. And at his time in Chile, he was in a conversation with a number of people who were really at the center of articulating an analysis, a critique of imperialism in the context of dependency theory. And so to think about us now, today, in the tenants movement and other movements, where we're understanding, practicing, experimenting with popular education, what is our relationship to developmentalism? What is our relationship in our movements to this idea that extraction and accumulation and monopolization of capital are the primary goals of development, particularly the role of the poor? So it's useful for us to keep that framework, because I think that problem, that question, remains present in popular education. Particularly, you go back a couple of years, just a couple decades, when a real big debate within popular education was its relationship to the formation of political subjects around resistance movements. Is popular education detached from that? Is it sort of auxiliary to that? Or is it the same? And again, it speaks to this ongoing question about what is the role of forming subjects, forming political subjects in a context of extraction and developmentalism.
Yeah, thank you both. That's very, very useful, I think, as this broader overview. I'm really appreciative of two kind of aspects of those answers, too. One, I think the practice side of things is really useful for our listeners, especially since we're often engaged in kind of analyzing a text on this show. And so hearing not just in the abstract, what are these principles, what are their characteristics, but also what does it look like when you are actually engaged with, the popular masses, essentially engaged in this type of education. That's very grounding, I think. And I think in the tenants union, you definitely see these ways of applying popular education, often, like you said, Christina, trying to avoid this sort of service model of just passing down know your rights style information and resources, but actually starting with experience in a way that builds this collective struggle for tenants. And so I think that's a really helpful framing. And Don, I really appreciate the kind of political context as well. Again, tying this into the tenants context, since I think that's what we all have in common in this call, I think we do see like this very sort of urban development kind of idea related to finance capitalism and extraction of value through properties on the market within the cities that we live and work in. And so that connection feels very relevant for why this is an important kind of political intervention as well. So I'm super appreciative of both of those. And I'm hoping, that can provide some of that framework so that our listeners just know what we're talking about as we're going into this. The next part of this conversation, and this is really what I'm excited about, is that several of you recently just returned from a trip to Central America where you interviewed popular educators. And before we started recording, I was hearing just like how extensive the amount of recordings that you all have is, which sounds quite overwhelming to parse through, but I'm very excited to hear a bit about this. So while traveling, you all had the opportunity to meet with Luis Sanabria, who leads an archive of what was a network of popular education centers called Alforja. And I guess my question for you is, can you tell us a bit of the history of that network and set that up for us before we get into the details of, where things look today and what you learned on your trip about the present situation?
Awesome. Yes, I'll get us started. This is Christina. Let's see here. So first, I would like to say that I feel a bit overwhelmed by answering this question, giving context for Alforja. It's like a 40 plus year history. And but yes, we had the pleasure of speaking to Luis in front of the center at the University of Costa Rica that houses the Alforja archive. We sat with him for about a 3-hour conversation outside of this little cafeteria where we ate some of the best college cafeteria food that I have ever like consumed. And so he commenced and told us the story of Alforja, which I'll try to give some of the highlights, some of the key things that came up during that conversation. So Alforja is a network of popular education centers that emerged during the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Popular educators from across Latin America gathered in Nicaragua to support these government adult education initiatives. There was one of the biggest initiatives that the government had was a mass alphabetization, a literacy campaign. I was reading that it was like 100,000 volunteers taught 400,000 people how to read and write within these first couple of years. There were the popular educators that descended on Nicaragua were from all over the place, from all over Latin America. There was Oscar Jara, who I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. He was a Peruvian popular educator specializing in literacy. Raul Leys from Panama, who was a theater of the oppressed educator. There was folks from El Salvador, from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Nicaragua. So all these folks were getting together in Nicaragua. They were doing the work, they were sharing information from their context and their countries and the different things that they were trying. And then they started to kind of plant the seed and think about, okay, what if we were to formalize this? So in 1981, Oscar Jara, who was the popular educator from Peru, started to gather folks together and officially formed Alforja. And so in this initial like convening that happened, they had some kind of central like principles that they decided that they would kind of laid out collectively, which was that they would be centered in a revolutionary context. They decided that this would be a regional group for Central America to support, popular educators from across Central America, not just focused on Nicaragua. And Oscar describes it as like a crucible where all of these different popular education ideas could be fused, together, such as popular theater, popular radio, folks who are doing conjunctural analysis processes, etc. So then, as Luis describes it, throughout the 1980s, Alforja began to host out of Costa Rica. So they ended up being based out of Costa Rica because, it was a very kind of tumultuous time in Nicaragua, and to be able to have some stability and also access funding and stuff like that, they made the center of Alforja Costa Rica, but it subsequently moved to other countries. We learned about that a little later on. And so Alforja throughout the 80s begins to host these annual convenings where they bring together popular educators from across Central America to exchange ideas, begin to theorize, etc. And they also, support a lot of popular education processes in Costa Rica itself. Through that work, Alforja begins to, categorize, document, and write about these popular education processes. They produced a ton of books and manuals, and that's really what we went to go and look at. We had no idea what the state of the actual archive was in. Hopefully Tony and Daniela can share a little bit more about what we found once we were there. Luis kind of shared with us that, the 80s were this time period where people were really articulating the political dimension of education, and that there was kind of these three key kind of branches of popular education that emerged during that time. One was obviously Paulo Freire's ideas around popular education. Another was participatory action research, which was written about by Orlando Falsborda, and systematization, I can never say that word very fast, of experiences, which was a process that was developed by Oscar Jara. So I'll talk a little bit about that because Oscar was kind of like a seminal figure in Alforja's 40-year history. And if what I understand in terms of systematization of experiences is just essentially that Oscar was like, okay, community groups are engaging in these processes of reflection that lead to action. We need to start documenting and writing about these processes so that we can learn from them, adapt them, critique them, etc. So that was kind of one of his key contributions to popular education. Luis also shared with us a little bit about another organization that emerged in the late 80s called CIAL, the Consejo de Educación de Adultos de América Latina. This was a popular education network that kind of cast a wider net across Latin America, and Paulo Freire was actually its first president. And then he talked to us a little bit about what happened in the 1990s and the 2000s, and about how suddenly, popular education gained notoriety and popularity. And so then NGOs and government bodies and the university were starting to pay attention, and how there was essentially like a period of time where popular education began to be co-opted. And so like anyone who was, doing popular theater or sitting people in a circle suddenly was, supposedly doing popular education, but not everyone was using it to actually challenge power or in a liberatory way. I think I'll pause right there and kind of let Tony and Daniela maybe kind of start to fill in some of the different ideas and lessons that Luis shared with us.
Yeah, I thank you, Christina, for that explanation. I will add a little bit about the context of that time in Central America and in Mexico, in the 80s, when and the late 70s, of course, when the Sandinista revolution was happening, and there were all these important moments in Mexico of guerrillas, of organization and social movement. And that's actually the 70s is also the moment where the Zapatista movement start the seed that will come later in the 90s. But I think it's just like important to imagine that time where Latin America was really pushing for a different politics, a different forms of understanding society and organization. Of course, it was like, this moment where the US was targeting all kind of projects, socialist projects and communist projects and red projects. It was always like the stigmatization of thinking differently. And also it was like the moment of the Teoría de la Liberación too, that we will touch different moments. We cannot go very deep into that, but the liberation theory of the liberation. So I think like just kind of understanding, which I'm sure much of our audience knows this, but it was like really a moment of like liberation and thinking through of a different Latin America. And Central America, of course, was playing a really, really important core moment. And I think that's why Alforja really come through into this network that still exists in different forms. And also it was a network that influenced here the social movements. And that's also something that Daunt has point out and highlight. And that's why our interest in looking back into that time and also in what has developed Alforja. And also something very interesting that Luis was mentioning to us in the 80s, because he, like Alforja, as Christina mentioned, has going through all these different moments. But the 80s, he was talking about like when they start this network, they were more influenced with the text of Martha Hanneken, which was also about popular education, but very focused on militancy through parties. And Freire was just finishing his book, so the influence was arriving a little after that. But he kind of like point out that moment that kind of like with Alforja, really they like kind of push to just not think into Marxism and like theory and like, but really thinking in how to practice that and how to like do popular education and think about a political dimension in popular education. I would stop there. I'm sure Tony has something to add.
I can just add that, a little bit of focus of, you know, when we met with Luis, and in particular, kind of approaching this history from our work within the tenants union. I mean, there's, I relate this a lot to when we look at other kind of big movements, especially in Latin America. We look at things like MST in Brazil or something, where it's just the scale is sometimes hard to wrap our heads around from the work that we do very locally in Los Angeles and other cities in California, and we communicate with other tenants unions, in North America, and it seems, so nascent in comparison to these, massive developed networks. And one of the great things about kind of Luis was because we went to, Costa Rica thinking about, Alforja, but also understanding it this, 40 years of big impact and this, nexus point of all of this work happening. And the great thing with Luis, and I think as Christina described, we're all still sorting through it and learning about it, is to just have some insight into the development. This big network and all of this development of popular education techniques, whatever. It didn't start that way, just like anything else. And so, but, we couldn't access, until we finally had someone to talk to, we couldn't access a sense of those origin points and those kind of, steps that ended up forming this cumulative huge impact. And so part of why we were particularly at the University of Costa Rica was that then Luis has coordinated to getting a lot of the materials from Alforja's publications, and then Alforja as a publisher, he's gotten a lot of that material then put into the library there, and into their archives, and so we were able to access that with him, and spent a day there with him, all four of us, kind of just getting introduced to what was there, going through the catalog, for everything that had been kind of connected to Alforja. And then Christina and Daniela had gone there other days too, to kind of dig deeper into this. And it's a lot of photos on our phones documenting these publications. But the best part about it, I mean, in seeing then this published material, is then we also see the practical records of these early points. And like one of the documents that I remember photographing this record cover to cover was just all the records of a workshop that was about kind of the formation of the liberatory educator in the Sandinista model. And it was a booklet really, from the 80s. And it just went through in hyper detail, every kind of discussion that was part of this workshop training program, breaking down all of these like exercises, and then even the kind of event planning for making the workshop and reference to kind of, okay, and here's how we'll do it next year. It was interesting stuff, and it was also the kind of dry records of just this, we're doing this work here right now, not thinking that we're going to make this 40-year-long massive, project, because you can't plan things like that. That's not how stuff works. And it was great to get an insight into that. And there's just like I think one of the things that was most exciting too in going through the archival material is the overlaps and just seeing these kinds of, ways that they were dealing with talking about the general subject of popular education that Christina and Don were describing, and then the role in pushing that ahead, and that in the where is the individual that and in the embedded in these movement spaces who is contributing to that expansion and keeping it from becoming the sort of spaces that just repeat exactly what the project is trying to avoid, and or keeping these people grounded in the movement so they don't end up in the kind of co-opted version that was described.
Well, thank you all for that answer. There's a lot of history getting covered here, obviously. And Christina, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of being overwhelmed by trying to provide all of that summary. But I think this was really grounded and very useful. I mean, in particular, Tony, I'm very interested in this idea that you put forward of these documents that in the moment, no one's really thinking about. This is going to be in an archive of this project that's been 40 years in length and how they're produced in that moment. And I think it speaks to the value of archiving that sort of document as well, because its importance might not be so obvious in the moment. And later on, those of us who are still trying to engage in these sorts of struggles need access to that information. And so there's a really interesting component there. The other thing that I really wanted to just shout out that I appreciated from the summary, especially Daniela emphasizing that revolutionary context that this emerged in, because one of the things that I think I've experienced and that I've heard from some of our listeners when we've tried to lightly touch on popular education before is encountering this co-opted version that all three of you kind of alluded to. And I know my background is like somewhat academic, and in the academy you find all sorts of people who say that they're doing popular education really just kind of in this watered down liberal apolitical way that is not actually engaged with movements of liberation whatsoever and becomes rather abstracted. So I think it's interesting to hear about the moment that kind of co-option emerged in that history, and to see how earlier before that there was this emergence of this concept and this practice in this very revolutionary context. And I hope that's useful for our listeners who have also encountered that experience of co-opted popular education. So, all of that is very useful, and I appreciate that background and that history, and I hope that can kind of color things as we move forward too. But the other thing that I wanted us to get into a little bit is, now that we know some of this history, could you share some of the other experiences of your trip with us? What other networks and contemporary groups did you have the opportunity to interact with on this trip?
Well, I can start us off in particular. So, I think we're all going to share a little bit, and it's important to say that we're sharing not in the chronology of our trip, but I want to name that in particular because there was, in part of doing this is putting ourselves in contact with people, and then it was by the end of the weeks that we were there and had met with all these people, there's this desire to almost do it again because there's so much more info that was revealed through the process. So it's just important for me to name that, because what I wanted to talk about is kind of in the middle of our time there. We Christina and I and Daniela were in Tegucigalpa in Honduras after we had left the city of El Progreso in Honduras, which others will talk about more. And we were in Tegucigalpa, and one of the key meetings that we had set up was with an organizer named Christopher Castillo, we were put in touch with through the people from El Progreso, which we will talk about more in a second. But he was an organizer from a group called ARCA, Alternativa de Reivindicación Comunitaria y Ambientalista de Honduras. And so it's a movement for alternatives in Honduras that is primarily targeting their work and focusing their energy on fighting against the various exploitative capitalist forces around Honduras, and with a special emphasis on what are called the ZEDEs. And the ZEDEs are basically these special economic zones. So, Zona de Empleo y Desarrollo Económico, but employment and economic zones that were developed by the previous government in Honduras in the 2010s, in the government that took over after the U.S.-supported coup. This idea of the charter city or sovereign city that had been circulating in the kind of libertarian tech worlds for quite some time. It found a buyer. Within the post-coup government in Honduras, this idea that had been the subject of like TED Talks and a lot of again kind of libertarian-focused, capitalist, tech world-focused press, found a market and found a willing government in Honduras. And what that meant, what did they find? Well, they found a government that was okay with the idea of basically making a kind of extreme version of what we can think of as a special economic zone, or the kind of free port idea, where there's special sections within a national territory that then are subject to a different taxation. Usually, you find this around taxes, subject to a different taxation, in part to, encourage commerce or stimulate commerce or whatever. And so you find this around, like, the free port idea. So you find this in, coastal areas where then there's a different or total elimination of kind of, tax burdens to move things through there. And that's meant to then be this, sort of catalyst for local development. And the idea in Honduras, with the charter city idea, was basically that the city would, the country would make land available. Then these formations could develop to to run their own private cities. And they would, at the end of the day, the model is that they would still be subject to Honduran criminal law and like protected by the Honduran army, but they could set up their own civil law systems, and essentially they're their own civil law, and it was a gift basically to the people who'd been pitching this idea from, I keep repeating tech, but that's really been a big driving force of the kind of people who are behind this. This is one of the reasons why one of these places that I'll talk about more brand itself as a crypto city. And so these places then, they operate in kind of in impunity. That there are these territories that are taken over by private companies, managed privately, and they're run as, think of them kind of like extreme exclusive country clubs that are meant for international money to come into Honduras and gain. They're not developed for Hondurans, but they use a lot of that language of this is we're getting around government bureaucracy, and then we're going to help the people of Honduras this way through the wonders of privatization. And there's three of them that Christopher kind of walked us through. So it was this incredible time that Christina and I had, where we got a 2.5-hour lecture on from Christopher, where we had gone into it thinking, okay, we're going to learn about the the kinds of whatever legislative or bureaucratic rules that I just described now. And with Christopher, it was like, no, I'm going to walk you through the entire kind of history of capitalism and United States exploitation of Honduras for quite a while first, before you understand the context of the 80s, because you need to know what these come out of. And it really did help us kind of see it more so. And so there's one of the most famous one of these is called Prospera, and it's on the island of Roatan, which is this sort of touristy island off the northern coast of Honduras. And it's a nightmarish libertarian tech privatized country club city space that is that benefits from basically being within Honduras and having this legislative permission to not actually, quote, be in Honduras. It gets to act as if it's in another country. And so we walked through this and we learned about it. And I wanted to, I'll share a little bit more specifics about some of them in a second. But the really key thing for our work was, and I think this was a kind of a consistent around this whole trip, but a key for our work in the LA Tenants Union was to see these future extremities of a lot of what we fight against in our work. I mean, from our position in Southern California, or I guess all of us in California, we watched Silicon Valley gentrify San Francisco, and we watched them gentrify other parts of the state, and then we've also heard them endlessly complain about regulation, and we've heard ideas of buying new land up Northern California and making these new sort of Silicon Valley areas. We remember that before Venice in Los Angeles kind of became the official Silicon Beach area, cities in Southern California were competing to have that stupid moniker, for years, and offering these massive kind of tax breaks, massive sort of open permissions for Silicon Valley to try to lure their money out of the valley in particular. And so we've watched the kind of tech industry crawl all over California, endlessly pushing for more and more kind of special treatment. And in the kind of 2010s, even as gentrification is rampant in the state, we're also, that was the era where the kind of floating city ideas were being pushed a lot out of Silicon Valley. This whole kind of, California's not taking care of us, and we're getting too much regulation, so we should start developing these barges that float around that technically, can become our own cities. And there was the Seasteading Institute, which Peter Thiel was connected to. The thing in Honduras, what we spent this time with Christopher learning about, was there's a place where this actually happened, where it actually got to develop. They got to make the kinds of places that they wanted to, where the laws of these places are the laws that the private companies running them want them to be. And the open permission to do what they want and construct their their cities free of regulation, there was a real place, there is a real place where this happened. The Zedes rule was struck down by the Supreme Court in Honduras in 2024 with the change of government to Xiomara Castro. But nonetheless, the ones that the three big ones, Prospera, Morazan, and Orquídea, still they still are there, but there's kind of a question mark about what's going to happen next with them. We think about kind of our gentrified cities. We think about kind of the neighborhoods where, gentrifiers, real estate, local city government weaponizes, everything to make this image of their perfect city. We think of when West Los Angeles, of, the kind of sweeps against, unhoused neighbors, and this sort of effort to kind of make this perfect ideal city space that's that meets our upper middle class standards at all times. It's essentially a private country club. That a lot of the energy behind that is tech money. You look at who's the ones driving this kind of increasing militarization of the police and of public space in San Francisco. It's the same people who are involved in Prospera. People like Peter Thiel, Mark Anderson, et cetera. And so I don't want to go on too much longer. With Christopher, too, he also then kind of explained the differences of each of these Zede spaces, and kind of, their different focuses in their own little specific libertarian nightmare cities. And Prospero was the one that was the most kind of jaw-dropping, because it was using this really like glossy architectural development, this whole idea that it's this like architecture urban destination that they're developing, because they're on this island where a lot of surfers go already. Then they're trying to amplify the tourism element of it, but it's also a place where they're putting a lot of money into genetic study of the types of the kinds of like Silicon Valley, finding the right formula to live forever. And so then we're hearing all these weird stories about like, collecting blood from local women, and just these kinds of like quasi on their way to sort of Mangala kind of experiments happening there that are all part of this, what can we do in our lawless tech city? And I want to pause there because I could eat up the next hour with it, but it was one of the most incredible kind of parts of this, that all we could read about from the U.S. is like, a few posts here and there, some New York Times coverage of Prospera, and a lot of like Reason.com like articles mourning the Supreme Court, ruling against these things. So it's like all we could get from here was this, incredibly superficial kind of view of what is this really important thing that people in California driving the changes in gentrification in California we've seen, like the Silicon Valley types, whatever, they know about this and they're already excited about into it, and that's what they want for our city. So this was a long way to kind of make this connection, but I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, before we pass it off to someone else, I want to just touch on that because this actually hits very weirdly close to home. When I was in undergraduate, I was on the debate team, and one of my debate coaches was a author who wrote for the Seasteading Institute. So I
Oh
actually,
wow.
unfortunately, have a lot of exposure.
Yeah, sorry to make those hairs stand up again.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting because I've seen some of the development that has happened. Again, reading some of the articles in the US around this because I followed that conversation after having that weird relationship with a former debate coach who comes from that. But I really appreciate this idea of seeing like the extremes that what we're seeing here are going towards, right? I organize with the Mar Vista Palms local of the LA Tenants Union. So we're right here in West LA. And I live very close to Playa Vista, which is where most of the Google employees live. And
Exactly.
and it is a bizarre place to drive through. There are just these walls of condos that basically close off an entire neighborhood that is inward facing. It has private parks that are like primarily for the employees of these tech companies there. It has its own little farmers market, in like basically, yeah, sealed off by this wall of buildings. And it is this strange little attempt at a part of the West Side that's cut off from everything around it. So, we see, yeah, a lot of this developing with that Silicon Beach idea here on the West Side and the extremes of the displacement that are still occurring, right? Our local organizes quite a few, buildings where we have these Oaxacan families that we're organizing alongside to try to prevent evictions for these developers who want to build that Silicon Beach idea here. And so that tie into what the struggle still looks like at home, I think is really useful.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, one of my, one of the most ridiculous lines that I had found in some of these, libertarian tech, like English language, US based blogs and whatever journals mourning this thing. So, one of my favorite lines is like, unlike other cities, which must accept anyone who wants to live or do business there, including criminals, Ciudad Morazan selects the residents through an application and vetting process, and saying that as a really celebratory point.
Right. How horrific, honestly. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that. Would anyone else like to report back about other aspects of the trip as well?
Yeah, sure. I wanna like jump into another big chapter, which was in El Salvador. We have the fortune to visit the Museo de la Palabra y la Imagen, which is in San Salvador, and it's a museum that was founded after the Acuerdos de la Paz, the agreements of the peace in the 90s. And it was founded by Carlos Enriquez, who is Carlos Enriquez Consalvi, who is also known as Santiago. That was his name in the guerrilla. And he also was the founder of Radio Venceremos, this radio that was the voice of the Frente Farabundo Martí of National Liberation. And it was like just like in terms of like this place is like an amazing place because they have they're of course focused on the memory, and that was something that we talk a lot, Christina, Tony, and I, about the preservation of memory, but also like the understanding of memory and the learning of history, which I think every person that we met in Central America, they were so well known. They know so well their own histories, and they can articulate the moment with the past, the present moment with the past, and they can articulate history also, like not only locally or like focus on Central America, but like globally and with the US. And so this museum has that focus on memory, specifically from the people of El Salvador. Like they have the archives of the thousand and thousand of cassettes from the radio, from Radio Venceremos. They have like the archive of a photographic archive of Monsignor, and all kind of like different archives, but they create exhibitions that are connected with the reality, but also with the history of the past. So we have the opportunity to interview Santiago, a little bit digging a little bit in also popular education. And he was telling us, of course, that Radio Venceremos was an instrument of education for them. And one of the biggest questions was like how you guys were able to produce, analyze, distribute information while you are in war, right? Like when you are like creating this revolutionary moment. And it was just like they were like totally dedicated to that moment. And he was telling us about a school, La Escuela, which was like part of the movement. And in the camps they will like meet to analyze history, but also analyze their own reality. So the Radio Venceremos will produce all kind of historic series from before the colony, the really analyzing when the Spanish came. He told us a really awesome story about a group of musicians. I can remember the name now, but from Morazan, which is the area where the revolution started there. And it was like a group of musicians that they decided to do theater, and in order to kind of like do like a type of popular education and like pass these histories. And the story is really awesome because they were musicians and they were already kind of like writing songs about the guerrilla. And then they started doing theater and went to a church, an abandoned church, and then grabbed the clothes of the saints and then wear it to produce theater. Which I find very fascinating. So it was just this thing again of like, I think popular education in that time was being tested and it wasn't that co-opted because they didn't have like all these big systems around them. So they will say like in the camps every day at 5 p.m. they will sit down and listen to the radio and they have all these kind of discussions. And other places where he pointed out popular education important moments was the refugee camps. The refugee camps were mainly were led by women because the women, escape with their kids. And there's in our first journal of Ultra Red, we actually have an article called Hilando el Momento, Weaving the Moment, that talks about these refugee camps, specifically the embroideries that were being produced there to reproduce their stories and tell the world about the massacres and the horrible violence that El Salvador was suffering. And it was perpetuated by the Salvadorian army, backed up by the US, and just like kind of to say it again, we know this story, but it's like the US intervention. But something very interesting, something that Tony was saying, like by the end of the travel, we wanted to go back to connect because we did so many connections later. So something very interesting is that before the travel, we produced this text. Don wrote this text with, I can remember who's the other person? Is that Christina? So and then later we met with Santiago from El Mupi, and then he's pointing out this important moment of popular education in the refugee camps, and he pointed out Teresa Cruz. Teresa Cruz is like a popular educator that started learning in the refugee camps, that later she also were part of Alforja, to the Red Alforja that we just talked. And she is also still very active. So these embroideries that usually are like napkins to cover the tortillas, they were being used to send messages, but also to like really embroidering a story, kind of retelling your story. So now she's using this technique to pass these stories through younger generations. So she's going back to, right now she's working in Chalatenango in El Salvador. And these workshops, she invites ex-refugee women to tell her stories, and then other participants and younger people or their own family come and embroider the new stories. So that was like something that I really want to point it out. And I'm gonna do a come and visit an exhibition that I have right now, that I curate right now in Red Cat of Guadalupe Maravilla. We have also 5 embroideries from the museum that belong to these workshops. So it's just like very important kind of like to point out this, like, we're talking about popular education, and something that Luis always was highlighting was also like the producing or encouraging the capacity of creativity, and how like art in other ways can participate in popular education. And then he also talks about they have manuals they will produce, I think like every week, like small manuals with the analysis of the reality, and that was like really, really important. And yes, again, like kind of connecting this understanding of your history, I think it's still very present in all Central America. We talk also just also to connect this museum that now is, like a very important center, not because it doesn't really function as like the museum that we imagine in the United States. This is a community museum. This is a place of encounter. This is a place where activists and people come to learn. And so just like connecting that energy. We also met with very young artists and activists that I will not mention her name because her vulnerability right now. And I think that's also important to say that Tony was talking about the tech companies, the Bitcoin, all these things that Bukele is like also involved with the US, and that also is affecting El Salvador. She was part of a group called Reverdes, kind of like rebellion of like green rebellion. And that was like a group of youth, like very, very young people. I would say from their 20s, most of them artists, and also people that were studying art and laws and at law school. And this group also comes from similar traditions. Like all these people come from similar tradition of like Jesuits that I know Christina is going to talk a little bit more about, Eric in Honduras. And they is a group that how they describe themselves, they accompany social movements. And what they have been doing these past years is working also with people that has been displaced, like with like tenants too, and in a totally different way. But I think that's important to highlight that now the difficulties of migrating and the like environmental challenges are really provoking a lot of like displacement and evictions, and the big developments that we are talking. Of course, these big developments are also happening in El Salvador. Like they're developing the tourism and the all the coast, and it's such a small place that is like causing like all this violent displacement of people. So they for example, she was very careful, because by that time there were already like 3 persons from her group incarcerated and criminalized for organizing and helping a community it was like a big building that was gonna be evicted, and they were doing a type of protest, and I would say it wasn't more like a gathering, like a manifestation, and Bukele repressed them, and they were, accompanying them. So just kind of like highlight that those moments that for me were very important, because we feel that we were so connected in many ways, and our struggles are connected with them. And I think like the importance of being in solidarity, even if it feels so far, Central America is so close, as we know, just because, not only because the communities are here, but we are, like our histories are all with. And I will let it there, because maybe I talk too much in this section.
No, not talking too much at all. I think that was really wonderful. And I appreciate calling up those international connections and hearing about fighting displacement and eviction in Central America is, I think, very useful for us here in the US who often think about our struggle, in these localized contexts within the tenant union, within our city, within our individual locals. But that international kind of solidarity aspect of it, I think, is so crucial. So I really appreciate you calling attention to that. Christina, I'll go ahead and let you add, some of your thoughts about other aspects of the trip.
Oh yeah, it continues. So yeah, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about our time in Honduras, and just start by saying that, obviously we wanted to go to Honduras because we had the connection to the Bordados, and to understanding that popular education work in Honduras through the first edition of the journal. So, over a year ago, I was listening to a podcast about liberation theology, and towards the end of the podcast, they went through, they gave contemporary examples of people who were still living and breathing, the ideals of liberation theology, and they mentioned this Afro-descendant Jesuit priest from Honduras named Padre Melo. Right away, I started reading about Padre Melo's history in Honduras. He has this, a great long track record of accompanying the poor. And from there, I learned about his work in this social center, this Jesuit social center called ERIC. And then I learned about Radio Progreso, which is a Jesuit community radio station that exists in El Progreso in the northern part of Honduras. So I'll give a little bit of framing about what ERIC, the social center, is, and talk about the radio station. But the key thing that as we started to dig more, that we wanted to learn more about was on one of these. I started listening to a ton of Radio Progreso, and on one of these shows called La Casa Común, or Common House, it was a show about environmental defenders. They mentioned this political formation school for young people. And Tony, Daniela, and Don and I right away were like, oh, finally, maybe we can learn about what this looks like, what popular education actually looks like on the ground in the current moment. So that was like the key thing, like we have to go to Honduras and figure this out. So I'll give a little bit of framing about ERIC and Radio Progreso, and then I'll maybe open it up a little bit to Tony and Daniela to share maybe some of the different things that pop into their minds or memories of our time with the youth that we spent with, or our time with the youth there. So ERIC, which is the Equipo de Reflexión, Investigación y Comunicación, that's the acronym for this Jesuit social center, was founded in 1980. It has these three branches. One of the branches is this whole investigative human rights wing, where they do a ton of legal accompaniment work. They support investigations for environmental defenders, land defenders, human rights defenders. There's a ton of extractivism and environmental, all these corporations that try to extract goods from Honduras. And so that's a huge problem in Honduras. They have this other branch, which is what they call territorial articulation. And within that branch, they do a ton of accompaniment work in like it has a very huge umbrella, but some of the highlights are they focus on indigenous rights, land defense, environmental defense. Within that branch, they have three different formation schools. They have the youth formation school, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. They have a human rights and environmentalism formation school, which is mostly for land defenders, helping them with their developing their campaigns, helping them understand the legal frameworks, etc. And then they also have one that's all about like ecology, and a different formation school that's all about ecology, connecting to the land, small producers, preservation of native seeds, farming without, synthetic fertilizers, all that kind of stuff. And then Eric also has this other branch, which is the communications branch, where Radio Progreso exists. Radio Progreso is a community radio station that has all kinds of programming. But one of the key things that they do is that they broadcast the work of Eric. So they have all kinds of radio shows that are about social justice and different kinds of branches of social justice that Eric is engaged in. But they also have like sports and gossip and music and all kinds of other stuff as well. And Radio Progreso, I should say, was its long history. It was started in 1956, and it has always, accompanied these different social movements to the point where two different military governments have like attempted to shut it down. Let me dig in a little bit more into the youth formation school. So just to give you kind of paint a picture for you, we had a main liaison that we communicated with that works for Eric. Her name is Natalie Ventura. And when we were having these conversations with her, and we were really nervous up until the last minute, like what was going to happen, like were we really going to get to talk to all of these young people or not? And then, like a week before we left, she hit us with this like 3-day itinerary that was completely stacked with youth in 3 different contexts and 3 different towns, where we got to hear from graduates of this formation school. It was incredible. The youth formation school is called Escuelas de Formación Política y Ciudadana. It was formed in 2008. Schools of Political and Civic Education is the translation. Our shorthand for it has just become Youth Formation School. It started in 2008. They accept 25 to 30 young people per year, ages 18 to 35. Anyone who applies needs to be a part of some kind of social justice or community-based organization to be invited to apply. The youth come from all over the country, from both rural and urban communities. Eric, the social center, provides transportation, food, housing, etc. for the workshops. Originally, the school was going to be was more intended for people who were connected to the church and people who were from rural communities. But over time, there was an internal analysis of whether or not that was going to continue to work and whether they were going to be able to recruit enough people, to form. And they realized that it just wasn't working. And so about 5 years ago, they opened up the school to a wider, to more communities. And so now you don't have to be affiliated with the church. And some of the main reasons why they did that was because, young people aren't going to church as much, or they're not part of these church communities, and many young people have migrated, right? They've migrated to the United States or to other countries out of necessity, so they wanted to, cast a wider net. So I'll just talk a little bit about one of the people that we met during these, so we met with different groups of graduates and current students of the formation school in these 3 different towns. And in one of our visits, we went to the town of Quimistan, and we met a young person named Kevin Ramirez, or a person who had participated in the formation schools when he was younger. And Kevin Ramirez, he's from Quimistan, and he talked to us about how, having the formation school be a part of his life had completely, it had transformed his life. He actually is a land defender and has formed an organization with a bunch of other former graduates of the ERIC formations of the Youth Formation School to fight against a hydroelectric dam project. He's been threatened with imprisonment and I think even temporarily imprisoned. He has had threats made to his life, and he is doing everything that he can to defend his land, to defend his where he comes from. One other quick thing I think I'll share is kind of like we're still kind of trying to understand all the different, like how are the young people formed? What are the different topics or different kinds of things that they engage in? So the formation schools happen once a month across a long weekend, and they have and there's 8 different modules. There's a psychosocial module, there's a feminism and masculinities module, there's a module that talks about the intersection of faith and politics, there's a human rights module, construction of publics, there's one about like learning how to speak through the media, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that kind of paints a picture, but I'll kind of turn it over to Tony and Daniela to see if they can kind of fill or talk about maybe some of the different things that they remember from our time with all these different groups of young people.
I mean, just going a little bit off of where you ended, I think one of the things that was so interesting when we got to the level, it's one of these things where by the time we got to the 3rd formation school that we were introduced to, our questions were a little bit more pointed about how this actually runs, what's the curriculum, so to say. Because it's like we were able to ask sharper questions because of what we'd been introduced to in the first 2. So it was another moment of wanting to sort of go back in time and do it again while we were there. But I think one of the key things too that we kept hearing that was a real consistent point from the participants was that nobody felt that they were signing up for a program to be convinced of something else by someone else, like that. And I know that that's vague sounding, but what I mean is that it was like there was some sensitivity about the idea that there are these kind of like indoctrination sort of focused programs that could be around, or that people might have encountered in from other directions. And so there was a kind of appreciation of the formation schools in that people felt that they could participate and really speak freely within them, and even as sort of differences of opinion would come up or differences of experience, that they made spaces to then sort of think about those things together from a group perspective, and especially even if those kind of differences of opinions were really important structural things, or really pointed to different oppressions. But that seemed to be a kind of a really key thing that people expressed to us regularly, was that it's like, here I'm participating in something where I'm getting to be in dialogue with people. I'm not just going and kind of being told what to think. And 2, I think it was that, while some of the things that Christina was, naming at the end of these kind of different modules, like, while, like we can kind of nod our heads along, like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Like and that's true. It's also that like the focus of conversations, or the modules for like this weekend, we're focused on this, and this session we're focused on this. It's like it's rooted in the experience. So it's again another kind of like obvious sounding thing to say, but back to where we began, in this sort of like popular education is the nonprofit popular educator putting you in a circle, and then this is the discussion we're going to have. Like everything that they're focused on is directly informed by like, what are the things that make poor people's lives in Honduras difficult, and let's go through those things, and let's go through them at different levels. So it's like learning about extraction and large forces that affect the environment, but then also looking at it at the interpersonal level. Let's look at machismo and sexism within our society, and and talk about that too. And so it's a program that's responding to the potential, the world that the potential future participants are coming from really directly. And I think that's one of the really influential parts of kind of seeing and learning about this model that we want to think of. And in some ways, it sort of points to things that we already do in the tenants union, of the ways that we, build our education work, for lack of a better phrase, out of people's experiences in, housing. Nonetheless, it was really important to see this more advanced model, essentially.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what I can add, because there's so much. But yeah, I would say also like seeing something that I was very impressed, and why these meetings were 3 hours. It was because everybody was like so critical. The discussion was like really, they were like really good discussions. People were like able to participate, and you can feel that agency on each of the very young people that we met in the discussions that we were having and we were asking. And definitely this thing that Tony was pointing out there, it didn't feel that it was a doctrination. Is that how you say doctrination? Adoctrination. Me coming from Mexico, of course, always is like the Catholic. When I see some Catholic thing, whatever thing, is always like suspicious. And of course, here it's other, it's out of, like there are Jesuits and they have like all this history behind and ideology, but they definitely are like focusing on like this kind of like creation of the subject. I mean, I'm trying to like, like really, I feel like everybody was able to analyze who is the oppressor, why is happening this, how you can like um, fight back. So I think that was like very impressive. And I will say, maybe just kind of to add something more um, anecdotic, it was like all these people that we met were like fabulous and beautiful human beings. And, like Natalie and her team were driving us around all Honduras, and we went to the coast. We met with the some students or alumni from the school that were Garifunas, like in different areas, and also like collaboration with other radios and other communities. So there was always like this sense of like, we are organized and this is our school, but also we are collaborating with other organizations and other radios and another groups. And it never feel that we knew, and they will sometimes point out the differences between them, but there was never like oh, I'm not going to work with them. There was a kind of like, we need to work together, this sense of like again of this solidarity network that goes back to Alforja and also Central America. And this sense of like, if we want to transform this society and our world, we also need to work together, even if there's some differences. So I was like also very impressed about that network, that also it was present in every moment in Central America. I also was doing research with artists, and it was always the same thing. I will like meet one artist, and that one artist will create a whole agenda of like similar agenda of like, meet these other 20 artists that are doing, there are also like I will say like artists there, they're so rooted in social movements. And it's like, because there's not like a very capitalist contemporary art system there, they are like able to work along with the social movement. So that was like very important. And I will say that's something that would like to see more in the tenants union, working more with youth, thinking more in the next generation. and not only because it's like I feel like this idea of leadership wasn't like, oh, we're passing our knowledge to the next generation and they are going to take over. I mean, there's like that knowing of preservation, but also I think it was like we need to bring all the different generations together to understand our reality, and we need to work together because every generation has a different tool. Luis from Alforja will point out that the podcast, no, now it's like the radio was something, now is the podcast, how the new generation is addressing. So yeah.
Can I just add one quick thing to kind of paint a picture of our time in
Yeah, go
Honduras?
for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just kept thinking about, and this has really stayed with me. I think we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next section. Is everywhere where we went, there were and I'm already getting emotional just like saying it, but there were commemorations to Honduran martyrs, right? Particularly folks who had fought back against extractivist projects. Um, in every inside of the offices of or the center where Radio Progreso and Eric is, there were posters and banners and texts about Berta Cáceres. 8 months or so before we landed in Honduras, Juan Lopez was killed. He was a land defender that was also fighting back against a hydroelectric dam. And yeah, and so that was like a big lesson for us. And the day we landed there, there was also a big there was going to be like a film showing, a film screening related to a massacre that had happened. I don't remember how many years previous. And so that was like a continual thread, I think, in our time there, was that there's just this tradition of these commemorations and not letting go of the sacrifices that these people, the ultimate sacrifices that these people made for their communities.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect, I think, to remember, and part of that building memory that has been talked about, I think, throughout this conversation, not just of the projects that have happened, but the people who put their lives on the line and, yeah, made that sacrifice for it, I think is really something important to highlight. So thank you for bringing that up, Christina. At this point, I think for the sake of time, I'm going to try to transition us to our next question. And it's something that really has been gestured at, I think, throughout a lot of what you all have talked about already. But one of the things on the show that we're always trying to do whenever we have any sort of conversation is ask, like, what does this mean for the struggles and for the organizing work that we're involved in where we live today? And sort of what lessons are there that you all learned that are relevant for our struggles in the US today? And I think, again, with particular attention paid to tenant organizing, since that is, again, sort of the common thread for the people participating in this conversation. Is there anyone who would like to share on that side of things?
Just to kind of, to note that it's, what Christina had ended with, about that film, for example, film, talking about these martyrs and about a fight from the past, and just how regular commemoration was. And of course, we're in a Jesuit and Catholic environment, and that's a kind of a really regular part within those sort of spaces. But like, when Christina was describing the radio program, like listen to Radio Progreso, and like you just hear some chill songs, and they have like the kind of Gen Z targeted pop hour kind of stuff, and like just like mixed into that, just the way that like whatever, like insurance commercials come up on the radio in LA, it's just mixing like we remember the martyrs from like and it just regularly put into it is this sort of constant commemoration, and also not just the sort of making it generic, and that while we were there, there was a particular anniversary of I believe people were martyred in the 70s while we were there, and so we're coming up on a 50th anniversary, and so then that was repeated, and in almost every space that we were in around El Progreso or where we were driving to these other formation schools, it was mentioned. I mean, basically a 3 hour period did not go by where we didn't somehow encounter mention that we were in a period of that anniversary. And like, one key thing within the tenants union is that, I mean, within, and speaking from the perspective of the LA tenants union, it's like, we there are people who we've lost in this struggle, and there are people whose passing is directly related to the toll of these fights take on them, and so just in that very direct way, it's key for us to treat their memory, as a more regular kind of part of our just general consciousness within the work, in that very kind of one-to-one way. But also just this notion of the way that the calendar is full of anniversaries that we encountered. Again, this very particular one being prominent while we were there. But just that it's, there have been big moments and there are dates of significance, especially in 10 years of the LA Tenants Union, that we thought it would be really key to make more regular space for acknowledging, hey, we've passed a year since that thing, we've passed 5 years since that thing, etc. We didn't get to do it to the extent that we wanted to with our 10th anniversary this summer, because the city's under attack by the federal government. But it was, I think, at least the energy around that before the ICE invasions began, was in that direction. Was a real conscious, at least, intention of an effort to make this kind of space that we saw that was folded into really everyday life. And so that was one key thing that is maybe a little narrow in focus, but just to get us going from where Christina was talking.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. I think, yeah, obviously things in LA took a turn this summer. Like you said, that wasn't necessarily expected, but I do hope that we are able to create those kind of spaces and that memorialization within the tenants union, because definitely, like, as a newer member of the tenants union, like trying to figure out some of this history and these important historic struggles and the people who did pass in relation to this work, I think would be very powerful. So yeah, thank you for that contribution. Daniela, were you gonna add something as well?
Yeah, I just adding with what Tony said, something that also in every person that we talk about, there's always like, no matter there was a war, there were a crisis, somebody was murdered, there was like a coup d'etat, like they will keep going with this memory, this preservation of memory. And I think that's something that is a muscle that we need to just like train, because they, even like Luis will talk about, like, their big assemblies is like there was always a group dedicated to like put together the information that happens there, analyze what happened, what we say, how are we going to move forward, and that information will be redistributed again. And I feel like that it's something that we need to do, because sometimes we have these awesome moments where we are like arriving to specific conclusions and then it just disappears, or it just go into the laptop of somebody. And I feel like that's like a very awesome lesson to learn from there, that is like this capacity of like, we need to preserve even what we are doing now.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And yeah, I think that preservation has been like a theme throughout this conversation that is very important to emphasize, because it's so easy to forget the necessity of it while you're just actively involved in what the present struggle is. So I appreciate the intentionality around calling that out. Christina, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you as well.
Yeah. On the very first day that we arrived in El Progreso, the first thing that was on our itinerary was to go to La Milpa. How do you translate La Milpa? Is it the corn? Is that right, Daniela?
The kind of like the cornfield or the field.
Cornfield, right?
The field.
And it's this, Eric has a land reclamation project, and every week they get together to, community members get together to tend the land and to engage in different kinds of agricultural attempts and experiments. And it's also a place where they eat together, where they cook together. And while we were there, we made these fresh tamales. The entire process from chucking the corn to grinding the masa to filling the corn shell, the corn skins, and putting the tamales together. And it was a really beautiful window into how people reproduce their lives, right? And how people share and spend time together. And so I think that that's another thing, looking within our tenant union spaces, or within our tenants associations, looking at the different ways that people reproduce their lives. Like when we engage in those collective actions of cooking together, making art together, etc., and how important those things are to sustaining our movements. I think that was also a really, really important lesson for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that also hits very close to home. Recently, we had a protest at the house of some of the landlords for one of the buildings where we're fighting an eviction, and we did an art day leading up to it to create signs. And it was actually, I think, one of the most beautiful moments we've had as a tenant association coming together. All the kids who lived in the building came out and participated, and really just spending all day together in the courtyard, eating, making art, talking, just being together as people who are involved in that struggle. Really, I think, was this incredible moment that really strengthened the TA too, and has strengthened, a lot of the connections and their resolve in the fight. So I think calling that out really does just hit close to home for the kind of work we're doing here, and trying to be more intentional about creating more spaces like that as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take us to the next question, just only because we've been together for almost 2 hours now, and I do not want to keep you all day, although I absolutely feel like we could just keep this conversation going. There's just so much here to dig into. But sort of as a final question, you all undertook this trip as a part of the Ultra Red Collective, and we've talked about that a little bit. But I was just wondering if you can tell us a bit about Ultra Red, what its history is, and sort of what its current projects look like as well.
I think I've been designated to speak to this.
Perfect.
This is Don, and thank you for that question, Alyson. So like any collective work, the story about what a collective is typically begins with where you entered into the collective. So for a lot of folks that have participated in the work of Ultra Red over the last couple years, the focus has been very much on the creation of a journal. We subtitle the journal as a journal of militant sound inquiry, which is a way of thinking about the relationship between militancy or political engagement and listening, collective listening, and learning together. But the collective itself is older than the last couple of years. Started in 1994 with myself and one other person. Both of us were involved in ACT UP at the time, specifically the needle exchange, working with drug users to give access to services and supplies to keep them safe. We were based on the street, and we were making recordings of those exchanges. We were also a techno band, and we were performing chill-out rooms and raves around Los Angeles. And this kind of weird combination of these two worlds, trying to figure out what was the relationship between those two worlds, not just drug use, but also what are the other ways that these worlds speak to each other. Over the years, the collective has brought in, attracted people involved in different social movements, including anti-gentrification, defense of public housing, anti-racism, genderqueer movements, and so forth. And the collective has grown to be international with folks in Europe, specifically the UK and Germany and Serbia. the inquiry of the motive of the collective has shifted, of course, as well, but primarily thinking about the practices, the praxis of political education or popular education. What is that praxis? What is it? What are we learning together? And a key component to this for many years for Ultra Red has been to think about collective work as having multiple sites of experimentation, of trying things out, trying to put things into practice to understand them, trying to develop things around organizing, political education, so forth. And by having multiple sites, then we learn together, we challenge each other, we inspire each other. And that kind of iterative and simultaneity of our collective has kind of continued in multiple spaces. And so encountering Alforja, which for some of us was back really in the early days of Ultra Red, encountering the iterative and simultaneous work of a network where it's not simply about connections and relationships, but it's also learning together and challenging each other, particularly around experiments and things that we're trying out. I'm thinking about how through the work of our three comrades going down to Costa Rica and visiting the archive, like encountering the just enormous amount of materials that was produced by Alforja over those 40 years, including a journal called Le Piragua. And that journal ran from 1989 to 2018, had 45 issues, and it was all about sort of critical engagement of education, popular education, adult education, but also then the political contexts of those experimental projects around education. And it just inspires us to think about like what's the role of a popular education collective like Ultra Red, the relationship that that collective has had historically with art practices, but then also how we organize in our movement. So the Tenants Union in Los Angeles is very much a network of different local chapters. No one will give you the same answer about how many chapters we have, but I'm saying 16. And how we learn from each other. Like we look at what each chapter is doing and how that inspires other chapters. Oh, we should try to do that. So if one chapter starts doing commemorative memorialization of people we've lost, that will inspire other chapters to do that. If some chapters start actually documenting what they're doing, either in writing or in podcasts, that will inspire other chapters. Oh, we should do that. And same thing with then the network of tenant unions across the United States and Canada, the Autonomous Tenants Union Network, which we started in 2018. Now you've got a conversation that's going on with people who are organizing in different cities, different municipalities, very different contexts. Christina and I are part of a project called Kitchen Table, where we get together once a month with people who are organizing different tenants unions across the states and Canada, and we just learn from each other and support each other, but also understand the experiments that each group is getting involved in, and how that can sort of push our movement beyond simply a kind of rights-based framing of what tenants' rights are, tenant movement is, to thinking more about, oh, we're actually reproducing our lives and reproducing community, and in the process resisting those forms that are trying to destroy our communities. That's been ongoing work to try to have that kind of moving us past a kind of tenant movement 101 into something that's more political and more radical. But the collective of Ultra Red is very much alive, and now, like as I said, it exists as this journal. So other things that we're looking at with the journal, we have an issue that's going to be coming out soon talking about Palestine solidarity and how Palestine solidarity has really shaped, reformed a lot of political movements in the US, Canada, and parts of Scandinavia. We have another issue that's looking at poor people's movements, specifically what you might call lumpen movements. So the unhoused, sex workers, trans folks, and how the political education, popular education practices in those movements really helps to begin to think about the formation of resistant subjects within super marginalized, super exploited communities. A lot of this is, trying to understand where we're at right now in our moment in terms of fascism and how fascism has really named its front for consolidating its power, its social power, and targeting Palestine solidarity, targeting trans folks, targeting immigrants, and targeting the unhoused. So, how do we think about what the learning is in those movements as they form that resistance? Because that would be then the vanguard of a kind of revolutionary project, and not the kind of vanguard that's being conceptualized, I think, in a lot of political projects here in North America. But how we look at the actual work of forming subjects, forming movements, forming knowledge, and forming networks for resistance. I don't know if that gives you kind of a sense of the scope of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that does. And I think that's super useful. And the interventions into, again, I think, like you just said, those spaces that fascism has declared is where it's going to be pushing its fight with increasing repression feels like an extremely valuable analysis, right? To be able to respond there and be able to push back in those spaces. I think, I also feel very thankful for your point about setting examples within the tenant work and, being able to push some of these practices that we discussed here today in a way that can cause it to spread to other places. And I know I will take this as a challenge to try to think about a lot of what you all have talked about and how I can bring this to my local and how we can try to integrate some of this. And I hope our listeners around the country will do the same. I know we hear from people who listen to the show who are involved in tenant organizing in other parts of the US as well. And so I really hope this episode will be a valuable resource and contribution for the work that people are doing. Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it there. I want to say thank you all so much for coming on. This has been, again, like really powerful, I think, just for me to hear, but also I hope for our audience. And I'm really thankful that all of you took the time to come and talk with us about all of this.
Thank you,
Thank,
Alyson.
thank you, Alyson.
Thank you, Ellen.
Gracias.
Yeah, we appreciate it.